Thank you, Drew, for coming on to the show. As we speak this morning, it has just been reported that Vladimir Putin has threatened essentially the use of nuclear weapons in response to Western sanctions. And this kind of goes straight into the heart of what you do as the co-founder and editor of Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, looking into money, particularly dirty money that supports organized crime and sometimes foreign oligarchs. Why did these sanctions make Putin so scared?
Well, really, I mean, he's been spending a lot of time stealing money from the Russian state. I mean, his whole system, his whole mode of governance is really designed on dishing out large amounts of money to, Siloviki and which is kind of his internal military intelligence branch, and the oligarchs, which control the industry, and organized crime. And, it's kind of a key, tool he uses to govern people, control things, and to manage Russia. And so consequently, to suddenly have that not so appealing to people within his, his inner circle, or to have them penalized around the world for his behavior, works really, really against him. And it's a really kind of a cruel setback after all this time stealing and managing this whole system. So,
from the earliest days of Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, one of your early breakthroughs was with the Magnitsky case that, of course, involved money laundering through Cyprus. Just yesterday, one of the breakthroughs in the SWIFT system was when Cyprus essentially okayed and dropped their opposition to SWIFT sanctions. Can you talk about the significance of that development?
yeah, I mean, Cyprus is, Cyprus very early on was one of the places that large amounts of Russian money flowed through, and Serbian money before that during the Milosevic years. And, it was kind of a key way into Europe. Because at the time there wasn't, when the Berlin Wall fell, there wasn't a lot of inroads into Europe, and so really Latvia and Cyprus became the two inroads into Europe. And Cyprus was built on, really, I mean, modern Cyprus, its whole political system is built on what we call the criminal services industry. Those were the banks and the law firms, and all these organizations that were serving this dark Russian money. And in fact, the president of Cyprus, Anastasiades, is a former lawyer who made his fame, working for these big Russian oligarchs, to get their money out. And the lawyers there have been putting their names on companies that are owned by the oligarchs for many years. So it was really kind of a close. The whole country was built for the most part on cigarette smuggling and on Russian illegal money. And so for them to kind of turn against it means that there was strong political pressure behind the scenes, or a threat of some kind possibly that would make Cyprus concerned enough to vote this way, or maybe the reality that Putin is a dangerous person, and I think a lot of people would love to see him go. And that may be what you're seeing in some of these countries. Even Hungary, voted in favor, of sanctions and other things. And Hungary is very close to Putin. But he's powerful. He's vindictive. He's malevolent, and maybe people saw an opportunity to just check his power because the invasion of a democratically elected country is really quite unusual and quite scary for a lot of people.
I want to definitely focus on what you aptly described as the criminal services industry. But first, I want to kind of unpack the basics for a lot of folks who haven't been very well versed in these things, or may not even be familiar with the very impactful work you and your organization have been doing for years. Can you give me a bit of a history of OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project?
Right. So we're a nonprofit that was started by myself and another journalist called Paul Radu, who was working in Romania at the time. And we decided to work together on a story because we were seeing the same organized crime figures doing the same kind of scandals in each of our countries. And we said, we really need to work together. And what we realized is, to fight an organized crime network, you really needed to be a network yourself. So we started to bring more and more people in. And that's kind of how we got started. But, it kind of, we were there at a time when there was really the globalization of organized crime and corruption. And this was really brought about by the criminal services industry. So they were, these law firms and banks are really helping, these relatively provincial Eastern European leaders to suddenly find that they could steal money and move it offshore, bring it back in another form and get done what they wanted to get done. And so as we learned how it worked, we realized we needed more and more contacts. And so OCCRP was really formed that way. And it wasn't like an intention to set up a august, robust, journalism center. It started because we needed to buy LexisNexis, Paul and I, and we couldn't afford our own copy. So we kind of created an organization that could buy it for us and then give it to each of us. And the name Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project actually comes from one of our first grant submittals where we put, this is the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. And that we never bothered to think of a name for the organization. We just said, oh yeah, that's that OCCRP money over there. And that kind of became our name. So it's really rather organic, and it wasn't designed to be an organization. It's really a platform, and we're the Uber of investigative reporting. I don't have journalists, on staff. I have somewhere around 60 investigative editors, and those editors just basically work with partner organizations around the world to kind of be the glue, the catalyst to bring together, big projects across as many borders as we possibly can. So there's no native enemy of organized crime and corruption at the global level. You have a couple of weak protocols and some agreements between states, but there's no law. And so we're really kind of the only natural enemy. We can cross borders that law enforcement can't. We can go after people, in different places and report on them and write on them. And, that's the only one that we're the only ones in other investigative reporting organizations, obviously, that are really kind of going after this kind of globalized corruption.
And your slogan is, it takes a network to essentially go after a network. And proud to have collaborated with you in the past with OCCRP. Yes. And trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together in how a lot of these organizations essentially disguise the financial trail. So to kind of hone in on that, people are hearing a lot about SWIFT these days because the SWIFT sanctions. Just to explain to a general audience, what is SWIFT, and how do investigative journalists around the world pick apart financial trails by, for example, SWIFT codes or anything like that?
Right. So SWIFT is really just an international kind of communications device amongst banks, which allows them to communicate the information back and forth to each other to instantly transfer money. So it kind of it's a standard that they can all work on. That kind of helps move things around very quickly. That's a gross simplification, but it's also probably the limit of my knowledge of how it actually works. In practice, though, it really is. It's the way it's kind of like IP addresses, or the way it's the protocol it undermines is under the internet. it's kind of the protocol that's under the financial system. So it allows you to uniquely identify bank, and so the combination of SWIFT code and a account number allows you to uniquely identify a particular bank account, so you can route money into that bank account. And because the banking system is so complicated, you have correspondence accounts, banks. It's very complex. What you need is to be able to know exactly where to go to and get the money in. So, without that kind of system, then banks have to manually talk to each other. And they can still do it, and they can still route stuff, but it's just much, much harder. And they kind of either have to use another system like the CIPS system in China, or they have to manually do it between banks. But then, there's all sorts of questions about how long that's going to take, and does the bank trust this bank? Is this really a good bank? All these kind of issues are settled by SWIFT system, but it just opens up all these questions on how to deal with it. And if you look at countries that are outside of the system, they're basically dead in the water. Places like Iran and places like North Korea, have a really difficult time, and they're just not in the flow. They have to go through everybody to move money, and it costs them then more money because they've got some person who's taking part of everything. So it's a huge problem for them. And as journalists, we don't often get banking data. Banking data is private in almost every jurisdiction on earth, but it comes up in places like lawsuits and in leaks. And so through leaks, we've been able to use banking data and actually follow the money. We always talk about follow the money in journalism. If you have bank data, you can actually follow the money. And then recently we finished a large project with Süddeutsche Zeitung and The Guardian and Le Monde on the Swiss banking system, and really to be able to trace an individual account and figure out who's actually getting that money is really a way that you can immediately expose corruption or criminality, because the offshore system is designed to hide who's really behind the money. But once you kind of lay that bare with the bank accounts, you can really see where that money is going, and it becomes a really powerful tool. So we've done a lot of stories. We've proven a lot of corruption and ties between criminals and government officials because of this kind of critical follow the money things that involve things like the bank accounts.
Mm. And very recently you tweeted, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, that Swiss bankers, you have blood on your hands. And so going into that Credit Suisse leak and series, investigative series that you just rolled out, what were some of the major revelations, most shocking revelations from this data set of banking data?
Well, it's kind of, it's the old scene from Casablanca where we're shocked to find out that the Swiss are dealing with corrupt people. So there was a little bit of, the Swiss have, banked everybody from Hitler to Maputo to, they have a long track record of banking some of the worst people in the world. But the reality was, what it was pretty clear is that it's far more problematic even than people suspect, because everybody knows, okay, there's some dodgy people in the Swiss banking system, but there's not. There's criminals, there's dictators, there's torturers, there's autocrats, they're still all in the system. And what was pretty clear, and I'm not talking specifically about Credit Suisse, but the Swiss banking system in general, but in some cases Credit Suisse, it was very clear that there were two sets of rules, that there were the rules for the big whales, the money people, and they just kind of looked the other way, because we're finding bank accounts with like $5 billion in it. That's a big bank account, $5 billion. How many $1 million accounts does it take to get up to $5 billion? A lot. And so consequently, those were the people who were most valued by the Swiss banking system, and they did very clearly look the other way with these types of people. When they recruited them, they just had a different set of rules. And what we could see is, for literally decades after some of these people were clearly identified in the public as criminals, or tortures or whatever, they still had their Swiss bank accounts. The Swiss knew who they were and did not do anything about it. And from what our reporting from talking to employees and former employees, recent former employees, they were saying it hasn't really changed. What happens is when they get in trouble and a name gets mentioned, then they get rid of that person. But they don't do it unless they have to. And the problem is, we didn't have, in data we got from Credit Suisse, we did not have Russian data. We only had certain countries in it, and they were generally countries that were in the developing world that did not have, were not, signatories to a number of the agreements that Switzerland or the banks had. And so consequently, a lot of the big countries were have sophisticated agreements, and so we didn't see these things. But it's very possible that most of Putin's inner circle is banking at these banks, and the banks can hide it, and they hide it by either setting up a trust, so it's a trust and it doesn't have a name; it's a numbered trust, and the ultimate beneficiary is not public. Of course, all records in Swiss banking are not public. In fact, if you release them, you can be arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison. And what we also found that what they were doing is they were going in and telling people, well, why don't you set up an offshore business? And if that business wants to set up a bank account with us, we can act as the nominees on that business. And therefore, our names as the bankers will show up on the business, and your name can be conveniently left off. And the problem is the laws are so protective and protect secrecy so much that even bank regulators can't figure out who's behind some of these accounts, and they're not allowed to ask. And so consequently, even if they wanted to do their job, which with Swiss bankers with Swiss regulators, there hasn't been a strong history of them wanting to do their jobs. Even if they wanted to do their jobs, they may not be able to uncover some of these people. And so consequently, it's pretty clear that a lot of Putin's inner circle probably have accounts at Swiss banks, and the Swiss are not going to let it out. And so consequently, that is really enabling, Putin and his inner circle.
And of course, Credit Suisse isn't far from actually the first large data set that OCCRP and other news organizations have studied and uncovered. OCCRP looked at the FinCEN files, Panama Papers, in terms of the usefulness of these data sets to try to pierce through the opacity. You have found a lot of this money tracing back to essentially authoritarian strongmen, particularly authoritarian strongmen in former Soviet republics. Can you talk about that a bit? Sure.
We've been very lucky. International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ, BuzzFeed, Süddeutsche Zeitung, they've brought us in on many different projects because we have a lot of reporters, in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus and Central Asia and other places that can work on these stories, and Russia itself. And so consequently, we participate in a lot of them. And the interesting thing about, you're always getting a piece of the puzzle when you get a leak. And, a good nested company ownership structure where, the company in Moscow is owned by a company in London, which is actually owned by a company in British Virgin Islands, which is owned by a company in Seychelles, which is owned by a company in Belize, which you don't have to give the name out, some jurisdictions where they don't even collect the name. And so consequently, it's impossible for law enforcement to trace that. And when we're doing it as journalists, we may catch the Moscow, London BVI, but then, part of it in a leak, but then we don't have the BVI, Seychelles, Belize part of it. And so you're always getting a piece of the puzzle, and you really have to kind of, work across all these leaks to really piece together what might have happened. And we're basically opportunistic when we do this. We try to find those cases, where we do find, a link that goes all the way back from the bad actor to, the bank account or the company. And we usually know who the person is who owns the company. A typical Eastern European or Central European process is where, the president of Tajikistan, sets up a company to do mining, approves a company to do mining, and it's owned by some British mining company that's listed on the AIM. But if you look at it, it wasn't really a mining company before. It was in fact maybe registered a couple of days before, the grant was the tender was given out, and then that's owned by a BVI company. And then, we'll find out that the BVI company, the beneficial owner, is the son-in-law of the president, and, that's an actual case that happened, although the names have been changed to protect the guilty, or protect my bad memory. But, that's very typical. Once you have an offshore company, you can always, you just pretend it's an independent company, and it could do everything from embezzle funds, like, you give $10 million out to do a brand awareness study to them, and then of course the money goes up to the British Virgin Islands, and you've just stolen $10 million. Or in December you've made a profit of 10 million, so you give a brand awareness study to the same group. Now your profit is zero, you don't pay taxes, and you got the money offshore. So there's all, if people don't know it's a related party, then there's all sorts of corruption you can do. A tender fraud where there's 8 companies bidding for something, but all 8 companies are, connected to the same party. So they, it's fake competition between organizations, and they all bid, 80 million when the cost should be 20 million, but the one that bid 79 million gets it. And, so these are all the kind of different ways that these, tin pot autocratic, thieves work in these countries. And it's just tracking them down one at a time. And you see them even though you don't know who's behind it, but you see it and say, okay, that's a corrupt deal. And, hopefully I'll figure out who's behind it. And when these leaks come out, you just kind of, every time there's a new leak, it can connect to 12 other cases that you are very close to getting, and you don't quite have it. So, and then also, we're still using Panama Papers. We're finding stuff we just missed, or as new information comes in and a name means something, then we can say, okay, we didn't recognize that name, and now we know it's a straw party or a proxy for some, president, and that, opens up the whole case. So.
And very often this is analogized to a Russian nesting doll, where it's, at the,
exactly.
You get closer and closer to the center of it, what's the actual true beneficial owner. So doing this painstaking work, it takes time, it takes very different pieces of the puzzle, as you mentioned. And the people who are nesting behind this series of entities generally don't appreciate the scrutiny. Your reporters, editors, and partners are often very much harassed, threatened, persecuted about that. Can you go into that history and the link between this, what you describe as the criminal services industry, and authoritarian blowback against journalists?
Yeah. So the first time we really kind of got in trouble, we've always been threatened, and we've always had lawsuits, and there's always been people that have been angry about our reporting. If you're investigative reporters, if you don't piss off everybody, then you're probably not doing your job right. That's what we do. We piss off everybody. It started with one of our reporters in Azerbaijan who simply got a leak of, it wasn't a leak, it was a download of Panama records, registration records, and found out that the daughters of the president of Azerbaijan owned a bunch of large construction and phone companies and things like that. Just, they thought Panama wouldn't ever release the information, but we scraped the data. and then reversed it. We couldn't search by name. We could search by name. Once we scraped it, we found their name in there. We found these companies, and she was arrested and charged with a lot of different things that were bogus, and eventually served 1.5 years in prison in Azerbaijan. And after a lot of pressure and us writing about 30 stories about corruption about Azerbaijan, because our model is that if they arrest one of us, we replace them with 30 others, and we continuously hit and probably did far more damage and really changed the impression of Azerbaijan as this friendly Muslim country to actually a corrupt autocratic dictatorship. And we kind of take credit for that. But that is kind of the what's been happening all over now. So our reporters in Russia have been labeled foreign agents. We've had reporters basically blackmailed with compromat and information about their sex lives or who they're sleeping with or other things to try to get them to to back off stories. Fortunately, none of our reporters have. Everybody comes out, publicly announces it, and fights back. But it's getting harder and harder and harder, and increasingly, the criminal services industry not only is undermining us in terms of laws that protect these assets in the West, but they often are the ones that are suing us or are the lawyers that are going after us in these countries. So they're helping their clients in these autocratic countries to attack the independent journalists, and that's why they have blood on their hands. They're really, I'm not sure they grew up and went to Oxford so that they could, attack, NGOs, on behalf of, ruthless dictators. But, that's who they are. And, if that's what they want to do, that's fine. But, it's making things very difficult. We've got people who are recently had a partner in Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan who was arrested and found to have drugs in his back pocket, which were planted at the scene. Other people were there and witnessed it. And now they're under surveillance by the government. And it looks like Kyrgyzstan is going to take the route of Russia, of basically strong arming reporters and preventing them from working in the country. But it doesn't matter. We can report, and we can report anywhere. And especially as they try to move their assets out of these countries, because they don't want to keep their assets in countries that have no rule of law in which they can be overthrown anytime. They try to park them in the West, and they send their fat children to London and other places to go to school. And that's where we can track them down, and we can show those assets that were stolen. That's what we do.
I want to drill down on that nexus that you're talking about between corruption and authoritarian blowback and oppression of journalists, the oppression of NGOs by people who don't want their dirty money traced. First, though, I want to talk about another thing that you had just mentioned, where oligarchs and their children, where this is a topic that's really on the news a lot, particularly just yesterday. I believe a senior U.S. official said that they are considering going after, for example, the oligarchs' yachts. I know from personal experience, having worked with your investigations, tracking private jets, yachts, that's OCCRP's bread and butter. Can you talk about your work in tracing not only illicit assets, but the luxuries of the oligarchs and organized crime networks?
Yeah, it's really, there's a few places where assets are stored, and they're stored in companies, obviously, stored in real estate. They're stored in bank accounts, and, they're stored in portable wealth. And these people have it all. And, the wonderful thing is, they're not, it's not the oligarch himself. it's his, girlfriend, usually a young woman, who's very proud to show her jewelry and her, sun tanning on the yacht, off San Tropez. And, that's where we get a lot of information. We track what's called open source intelligence, where we look at people. And, if you look at what watch they're wearing, if you look at what purse they're carrying, and you can identify it, the daughters of the president of Azerbaijan were carrying $160,000 purses that were worth $160,000 a piece. And we found about 5 different colors. So that's over $500,000 in purses alone, and so consequently, if you look at all these types of, information sources, you can slowly put together, a list of all their assets. And that's what we do. Yachts are registered. There is an owner. It's often hidden, but there's many different transactions that a yacht goes through, from buying gasoline to hiring crews to renting space on the quay to various licensing in many places. And that's where we look at all these records and try to find something that traces back to the person that we're interested in. But often it's a matter of somebody who used to work on the crew, discussing how the yacht was used, or it's finding open source intelligence of them having fun on the yacht. It's no, to have a great yacht, you want to be able to post pictures and show how much fun you're having and what a great person you are. And that's their downfall all the time. So and then the other thing is, yachts can be traced anywhere they go. And so they go and meet with other, yachts. They all go down to St. Bart, around Christmas time for, big oligarch fest, down in St. Bart's. And we can, track the yachts down there because we can see where they all are located, and we can get the numbers, and we can check the backgrounds of those yachts. So you have to have kind of all these different tools to figure out all the assets. And then you piece them together, and then you calculate them, and you find out what their annual salary is. Most of these people have never been anything other than a government official their whole life, which usually pays about $5,000 a month in most of these countries. And they can never explain any of the wealth that they have. You also have to look at family members, at, ex-wives. They hide many of these assets in these people's names. And so it's a very laborious process, but, that's what can be seized, because that's stuff that's stolen from the people. And the people should get that information. They should be able to get those assets back. And, we work with Transparency International, who, part of our global anti-corruption consortium. They file, requests, whether it's a Magnitsky filing, whether it's an unexplained wealth order, to essentially recover these assets on behalf of the people.
If governments start following through, for example, the U.S. government starts following through on this threat to seize some of these yachts and send some of the children of oligarchs back, what kind of message do you think that will send? Would this be a breakthrough or departure from what we've been seeing in the past?
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is war now. I mean, people are dying in Ukraine, and they're dying because in the West, we didn't do anything about this for a very long time. It was clear huge amounts of money was being stolen from these countries. Russia was transferring somewhere around $160 billion a month at its peak into the West. This was money that is, opaque money. It's getting laundered, and it's showing up in the West as laundered money. It's money that has been used to, Putin doesn't send money from the state treasury when he wants to support, Marine Pen or, an extremist party or, a wedge issue party. His oligarchs fund it. So his oligarchs make all this extra money, they move the money to the West, and then that becomes basically a bad actor in the West, funding extremism, hate groups, propaganda, anti-democratic processes. These people have been anti-democratic from the very beginning. They don't know what democracy is. They're profoundly anti-democratic. And their money, when it goes into the West, supports things like Brexit and other kind of extreme, ideas. And so consequently, you don't want it there. And then what it does is it impoverishes the people. It raises the cost of money in these countries, so that, small business people are paying very high rates to get money or to buy a house or to do anything. And that's impoverishing these countries. And then it's creating a gigantic bubble in places like England and New York. And they've stopped building middle-class housing, and all they build now is wealthy housing. People like Donald Trump was essentially, he was a criminal services person who was building, apartments for organized crime figures so that they could launder their money in the United States. And he did it through New York LLCs. It's grossly distorted our market in the West, and it's made money cheap for us, which has led to speculation and housing bubbles. And middle-class people don't live in the center of a lot of cities anymore. They have to move farther and farther out. So it's not helping either side at all. It's terrible money, and it's dark, opaque money that's profoundly undemocratic. And so it's a bad system that we need to end. So I'm hoping that this process, now that Russia has actually started spilling blood around the world, let's get tough. Let's close all these assets, take them all away. Let's make them pay for the damage that they're causing in Ukraine with their own assets.
And once these specific actions, these rounds of sanctions specific to the war are rolled out, what can be done to combat the criminal services industry in a kind of sustainable way? What would make this opaque sloshing of money more transparent? How could we identify bad actors, organized crime groups, and oligarch expenditures in a way that is not geared toward one event or one war, but empowers investigative journalists like yourself and journalists around the world moving forward?
Transparency. I mean, we need far greater transparency around the world. The fact that business registrations are getting much harder to get access, even in places like the United States, is completely wrong. We should basically wall off jurisdictions that have bad policies, things like bearer shares and unnamed owners. Places like BVI. BVI is probably not the worst problem in the world anymore. It's places like Marshall Islands and Seychelles and Belize. And basically, if you've got one of these jurisdictions, say you cannot have a business that does business. A Belize business cannot do business in the UK unless they make a full disclosure of who the owners are, and that should be a public record. Let's get rid of offshore companies because if you shine a bright light on it, the rats can't go scurrying in the dark. They can't be there. It's the best system for kind of doing it. So if they put a greater transparency, that would help. Now, businesses are saying you don't want to do that because sometimes you don't want a business to know that you're entering this market or something like that. Yeah, sure, there are business reasons why you might not want transparency, but the bad side of the coin is so much worse that businesses should have to accept full and open transparency, of companies. And I think, the other thing is real estate is often, owned by offshore companies. That needs to change. We need to know who owns the real estate in our town, and not just the government, but the public needs to know who has that. And I think that would go a long way to doing it. And I think, places like Switzerland, we have to stop them. They can't be Switzerland anymore. You can't have banking secrecy. It's just not something that works in modern times. I would treat Switzerland like Panama. It has a reputation for being, such a sophisticated place, but it's just a mountain retreat of crooks. Swiss bankers are, really some of the worst enablers in the business. They'll deal with anybody as long as they make money on it. And we can't afford that anymore. They basically say you cannot own a Swiss bank account if you're a citizen of a particular country. And as much as you can wall off the bad actors and then force the jurisdictions where people want to own property to be as transparent as possible, you clean up a large amount of those problems. And then the other thing is you need to start treating all asset classes equally. Right now, banks have very strict know your customer and other requirements that they have to have. And in many places, they will follow those, although often sometimes not for rich people. But if they do not follow them, they need to go to jail. They got to stop relying on, hey, this is the company that did it, it's not me. You need to start putting bankers in prison. White collar crime is enforced at a rate much less than street crime or violent crime, and it's far more dangerous and damaging to our countries. And so we need to have clear laws on the books that people have to accept responsibility for their actions. And if you let Vladimir Putin open up a Swiss bank account, and you knew that, you should go to prison. And you should spend some hard time doing that, because you've just enabled somebody to do a lot of corruption. He couldn't have done it without you. You are part of that corruption. You need to pay the price equal to them. And so I think those types of things. And then the asset classes like real estate need to have know your customer laws on them. And hedge funds need to have know your customer laws on them, and they need to be regulated. Why do hedge funds get this giant gap that they can go do pretty much anything they want and not have to release a lot of information? And so consequently, all asset classes need to be treated equally, and they all need to be regulated to the same degree. And that's going to be a lot of regulation, but these asset classes blew it. They misused and did a lot of bad things. And so consequently, the people who work in that industry are not going to have to pay the price by increased regulation, because it's undermining our democracy. And if we don't do it, we will be in deep trouble.
Mm. And OCCRP is based in Central Europe, Sarajevo in particular. You have reporters all over and reporting partners all over the world. What is the feeling in your newsroom these days, given Russia's invasion of Ukraine? I am sure it hits folks, some of the people on your staff, very close to home. Has this affected your work at all? Has it given folks a greater sense of mission, knowing, as you guys know, particularly the connection between these opaque flows of money and global conflict and invasion by Russia into Ukraine?
Well, autocratic countries are by definition more unstable than democratic countries. And so consequently, they are a serious problem, and Putin has attacked people in the past to improve his standings in the elections. This, I think, feels different, but yeah, we have people. I think everybody's taking it differently, but this is a bellwether moment, I think, in the world. This is a takeover of a democratically elected government that is in this region by an autocratic government that seeks to basically dissolve it. And this hasn't really happened since Hitler. And I think a lot of people understand that, and a lot of people around the world understand that. A lot of friends of Russia have become very quiet lately, or are mumbling things about there shouldn't be war. And I think that's people understand that this is crossing a line, and it's a real serious problem. So we as journalists, we always knew Vladimir Putin was an unstable person. I have what I call the 10-year rule. When somebody has been an autocrat for 10 years, after that point, they kind of lose touch with reality. And you're seeing that in Azerbaijan, and you saw that in Central Asia a lot. And they become, messianic, or they become megalomaniacs, or they become a little bit crazy. And Putin now is thinking about his, he's been talking a lot about history, and that's a bad thing, for an autocrat to talk about history, because, now they've lost touch with the fact that what they do is significantly impacts people. And, Ukraine is a huge country in the middle of a very unstable region. And this has huge implications for the Caucasus, for Moldova, for the bordering edge of Europe. And a lot of people are scared, and a lot of people are really, really concerned. And once we fire all of our sanctions against him, what's to stop him from going into Moldova or Georgia or any of these other countries when it's clear we're not going to fight him, right? So if you're not going to fight him, and you've fired all your sanctions, then he can just keep taking over countries, and he might do that and reestablish the Soviet Union, and that may be his history that he's thinking about. So that's what's got a lot of people concerned and worried. And I think the journalists understand. Unfortunately, we don't, we're not good at war coverage. We're not really good at politics. We're about crime and corruption. We're about following the money. And so in a way, it makes it starker. And I think it'll be very interesting to see how these sanctions happen. And it'll be very interesting to see how much pressure is put on these offshore jurisdictions, which Russia has moved a lot of assets to, or the ownership of their assets are held. And, I think the power of the West to dig into these assets is quite powerful, and they can take most of them away. And that'll be very interesting. We're looking to identify them. And if we find them, we've published a ton of them, but we'll keep publishing them. And, hopefully, the money is used from those to right some of the wrongs that he's created.
Thank you very much, Drew.
Great to be here. Thanks.